Hello, I'm Essay, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
In the intellectual landscape of the early 1990s, few philosophical works arrived with the force and deliberate purpose of Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter, published in 1992. The text served as a crucial clarification and a formidable deepening of the arguments first presented in her seismic 1990 work, Gender Trouble, the widespread interpretation of performativity as a kind of theatrical, voluntary choice, a daily selection from a wardrobe of genders represented a profound misreading of her initial thesis. This popular caricature painted a picture of a disembodied subject, free to construct identity at will, a position that elided the very real, often violent, constraints imposed upon bodies. Bodies That Matter confronts this misinterpretation head-on. It poses a far more difficult and foundational question: how can we account for the material solidity of sex, the very givenness of the body, without resorting to the comforting fictions of biological determinism? The book's radical only that matter itself, a very substance we call sex, it produced through the regulatory power of Judith Butler begins her intervention by unsettling the established feminist distinction between sex and gender. This conceptual separation, while politically useful for arguing that cultural norms were distinct from biological destiny, carried an unintended consequence. It inadvertently solidified sex as a passive, prediscursive, and politically neutral surface upon which the active inscriptions of gender occurred. The body became a kind of raw material, a biological constant existing outside of power, waiting cultural signification. Butler's analysis reveals this foundation to be an illusion, a powerful normative fiction. She argues that the very idea of a prediscursive sex is an effect of a specific regulatory apparatus. The act of naming sex, of categorizing it, is the very act that brings it into being as a seemingly natural fact. The body, therefore, if always already a product of the discursive frames that seek to interpret the central mechanism for this process of materialization, is a refined theory of performativity. The concept moves away from the language of individual performance and instead embraces a more compelling model of citational practice. Here, Butler's debt to Jacques Derrida's work on iterability becomes explicit. Performativity is a forced and ritualized repetition of norms, a citation of established conventions that, over time, congeal into the appearance of a natural law, and body comes to cohere as a recognizable sex through the constant, authoritative citation of the heterosexual matrix, a pervasive grid of intelligibility that insists on a causal link between a stable sex, a coherent gender, and a normative sexuality. This is a process with immense temporal weight. It is the accumulated force of these citations, spoken and unspoken, that produces the material effect of a sexed body. This materialization is a powerful process of sedimentation, where discourse hardens into what we perceive as anatomy. This regulatory framework operates through a logic of production and exclusion. For some bodies to matter, to appear as real, intelligible, and human, others must be rendered unintelligible, cast into a domain of the abject. Abjection is the zone of unlivable and uninhabitable bodies, those who fail to properly cite the norms of the heterosexual matrix. These are the bodies that disrupt the seamless narrative of sex and gender, whose very existence exposes the constructed and precarious nature of the norm. This process of abjection is fundamental to the constitution of the subject. The I that emerges as a viable subject is one whose boundaries are secured by repudiating and expelling these abject possibilities. The limits of sex, referenced in the book's subtitle, are therefore the boundaries of intelligibility itself. These limits are policed through a violence that renders certain lives precarious and foreclose. To theorize a materiality that escapes this binary logic, Butler performs a remarkable philosophical maneuver in her chapter, The Lesbian Phallus. She turns to Plato's notoriously difficult concept of the chora for Timaeus. The chora is described as a receptacle, a spacing, or a site of becoming that precedes and enables the imposition of intelligible forms. It is a materiality that is disorderly, unformed, and eruptive. Butler seizes upon this ancient concept to articulate a vision of matter that is dynamic and generative, a site of potential that exists prior to its stabilization as sex. This choric space represents a form of corporeal possibility that exceeds the logic of sexual differentiation. It provides a philosophical resource for imagining and affirming bodies that exist outside the legible categories of the heterosexual matrix. The invocation of the chora is a powerful argument for a materiality that is a process of continual materialization, a dynamic becoming that always contains the potential to disrupt the norms that attempt to fix it. This reframing of matter itself as a temporal and discursive effect, an ongoing process rather than a static substance, constitutes the book's most profound and enduring contribution to philosophy. The influence of bodies and matter proliferated through a process of intellectual application, its value demonstrated within the philosophical frameworks and critical analyses it enabled. The book offered less a set of empirically verifiable claims and more a powerful analytic apparatus, a new lens for viewing the relationship between discourse, power, and embodiment. Its vindication emerged in its utility, in the way subsequent scholars took up its conceptual tools to dismantle and reinterpret phenomena across a range of disciplines. The work's resonance grew as its central thesis concerning the discursive production of materiality provided a compelling explanation for the persistence of social hierarchies and the lived experience of bodies at the margins. It empowered a generation of thinkers to ask different questions about identity, moving inquiry from essentialist foundations toward an examination of the regulatory mechanisms that produce our sense of the real. The book flourished by becoming a cornerstone for new theoretical constructions. Its vitality, proven through its generative capacity for further thought, this profound rethinking of subjectivity and materiality elicited significant intellectual resistance, particularly from feminist theorists who perceived a political peril within Butler's deconstructive project. Sailor Ben-Habib articulated a deep concern that by dismantling the category of woman into a product of contingent and unstable discursive practices, the very basis for feminist political action was being eroded. If there is no coherent subject of feminism, she argued, then the collective agency required for political struggle dissolves into a series of isolated performative acts. Martha Nussbaum leveraged a more direct critique, asserting that the work's dense, highly specialized prose served to obscure its arguments and detach academic theory from the urgent, material needs of oppressed women globally. For Nussbaum, the focus on parody and subversive repetition offered a politically weak response to concrete systems of violence and inequality. These critiques presented a formidable challenge, forcing a sustained debate about the relationship between post-structuralist theory and the pragmatic demands of political mobilization, a tension that continues to animate feminist and queer theory. The conceptual power of Butler's framework found potent and specific application in the work of subsequent scholars. Jack Halberstam's landmark study Female Masculinity stands as a premier example of this intellectual inheritance. Halberstam takes the theoretical apparatus of performativity and materialization and employs it to analyze expressions of masculinity in female-identified and transmasculine individuals. This investigation moves beyond a simple catalogue of styles, instead demonstrating how female masculinity is a constructed and performed gender, produced through specific cultural codes, practices, and bodily stylizations. Halberstam's detailed examination of drag kings, butch identities, and cinematic representations makes Butler's abstract theory tangible. It provides a concrete demonstration of how gender norms are both cited and subverted, and how bodies come to matter as masculine outside the traditional male frame, perfectly illustrating the discursive limits and possibilities Butler outlined. Further extending this line of inquiry, Paul B. Preciado's work pushes Butler's concept of materialization into the landscape of late 20th and early 21st century biotechnology. In texts like Testo Junkie, Preciado theorizes the emergence of what he terms the pharmacopornographic regime. This system describes a mode of power where subjectivity and the body are produced and regulated through a nexus of pharmaceuticals, media technologies, and the global pornography industry. Preciado's autotheoretical account of his own testosterone administration becomes a critical site for exploring how chemical and digital discourses literally write themselves onto the flesh. This represents a powerful evolution of Butler's argument, adapting the idea of discursive materialization to an era where hormones and algorithms have become primary tools in the construction of sex and gender. Preciado's work confirms the enduring analytic force of Butler's initial formulation while updating it for new technological realities. The cumulative effect of this theoretical lineage was foundational in establishing transgender studies as a distinct and vibrant academic field. Butler's intervention was instrumental in shifting the dominant paradigm away from a medical model, which often pathologized transgender identity, toward a framework rooted in philosophy, cultural studies, and political theory. By centering the concepts of performative identity and discursive materialization, the field gained the tools to analyze gender affirmation as a process of becoming, a negotiation with social norms, and a political act of self-definition. This theoretical vocabulary remains profoundly relevant to contemporary political struggles. Debates over gender recognition, the social weight assigned to pronouns, and the ongoing analysis of how racial categories are materialized on bodies all resonate with Butler's core insights. The theory of abjection provides a powerful means to understand how certain lives are rendered precarious and unintelligible, while the theory of materialization explains how these political struggles have tangible, bodily consequences. Ultimately, the revolutionary achievement of bodies that matter was its fundamental reorientation of a central philosophical question. The inquiry shifted from a static ontological problem, what is a body, to a dynamic and political one. How do bodies come to matter? This change in perspective reframes materiality itself. It ceases to be a passive surface, a pre-discursive substance upon which culture writes its meanings. Instead, matter becomes an active, temporal process of materialization, an ongoing effect of regulatory power, drawing on ancient philosophical concepts of a primordial, unformed potentiality. Butler conceives of a materiality that is a dynamic and generative process, a site of possibility that always precedes and exceeds its stabilization as a sexed body. This vision offers a resource for affirming corporeal realities that exist beyond legible norms. This reframing of matter as a continual becoming, a process that holds the potential to disrupt the very conventions that seek to fix it, constitutes the book's most profound and lasting contribution to modern thought.
We really appreciate you tuning in to this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.